They expelled Rachira for saving an Apache, but in 24 hours, 100 horsemen would bow before her. She just didn't know it yet as she knelt beside the bleeding man, her hands already stained red. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Cedar Flats when Rachira heard the gunshots, 3 sharp cracks echoing off the wooden buildings, followed by shouting voices and the thunder of hooves. She was sweeping the porch of Murphy's General Store, her worn dress catching the desert wind, when she saw him. The Apache warrior stumbled between 2 buildings, clutching his shoulder where blood seeped through torn buckskin. His long black hair was matted with dust and sweat, his face twisted in pain but his eyes still fierce. Behind him, she could hear Townsend's voice booming orders to his men. "Find that red devil! He can't have gone far bleeding like that." Rachira's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct told her to look away, to pretend she'd seen nothing. The people of Cedar Flats had one rule about Apaches: shoot first, ask questions never. But something in the wounded man's eyes stopped her cold. He locked gazes with her for a split second, and she saw not the savage everyone claimed Apaches to be, but a human being in desperate need. Blood dripped steadily from his fingers onto the dusty ground. Without thinking, Rachira dropped her broom and rushed toward him. She grabbed his good arm and pulled him toward the back of the store, her mind racing. There was a small storage room behind the building where Murphy kept his winter supplies. "This way," she whispered urgently, though she knew he might not understand her words. The Apache warrior, Swift Eagle, though she didn't know his name yet, stumbled along beside her, his breathing ragged. She could hear Townsend's men getting closer, their boots pounding the wooden sidewalks, their voices growing louder. Rachira shoved open the storage room door and helped Swift Eagle inside. The space was cramped and dark, filled with sacks of grain and preserved goods. She pressed her finger to her lips, hoping he'd understand the need for silence. Outside, Townsend's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Check every building! That Apache scum is hiding somewhere close." Rachira's hands shook as she tore strips from her petticoat to bind Swift Eagle's wound. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, which was lucky. No fragments to dig out. But he was losing blood fast and his skin was growing pale. She worked quickly, pressing the fabric against the entry and exit wounds, trying to stop the bleeding. Swift Eagle watched her with those dark, intense eyes, and she found herself wondering what he was thinking. Why had she done this? Why risk everything for a stranger, an enemy according to her people? The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. Heavy boots on the wooden floor of the general store. Murphy's voice nervous and stammering. "I ain't seen nothing, Mr. Townsend. Been in the back counting inventory all morning." "Search it anyway," Townsend commanded. "That Apache's bleeding bad. He needs shelter." Rachira pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so loud she was sure they'd hear it. Swift Eagle had gone completely still, his breathing shallow but controlled. Even wounded, he was a warrior. The footsteps moved through the store, boxes crashing to the floor as they searched, getting closer to the storage room. Rachira closed her eyes and prayed to whatever god might be listening. But prayers don't stop determined men with guns. The storage room door burst open, and Townsend filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his weathered face twisted with rage. Behind him stood 3 of his men, hands already moving toward their weapons. "Well, well," Townsend's voice was deadly quiet. "Look what we got here." Rachira stood slowly, placing herself between Townsend and the wounded Apache. She could feel Swift Eagle tensing behind her, probably preparing to fight even in his weakened state. "He's hurt, Mr. Townsend," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "He needs medical attention." Townsend's laugh was harsh and cold. "Medical attention? That savage killed 3 of our men last week during the raid on the Mitchell place. He deserves a rope, not bandages." "You don't know it was him," Rachira protested, though she knew her words were falling on deaf ears. "Don't matter now." Townsend stepped into the storage room, his men crowding behind him. "What matters is that you just committed treason against your own people, girl. Helping the enemy is the same as being the enemy." The weight of what she'd done hit her like a physical blow. In Cedar Flats, there was no forgiveness for what she'd just done. No second chances. No mercy. But as Townsend's men roughly hauled Swift Eagle to his feet, and as the Apache warrior looked back at her with something that might have been gratitude in his eyes, Rachira realized she didn't regret it, not for a second. What she didn't know was that her act of compassion had just set in motion events that would shake Cedar Flats to its very foundations. Because the woman they were about to cast out into the desert wasn't who any of them thought she was. And tomorrow, when 100 horsemen rode into town, everything would change. The town square filled with angry voices as word spread like wildfire through Cedar Flats. Richera stood in the center of a hostile circle, her hands still stained with Swift Eagle's blood, facing the judgment of people she'd known her entire life. Townsend paced in front of her like a caged wolf, his boots kicking up dust with each heavy step. The Apache warrior was nowhere to be seen, probably already locked up in the makeshift jail behind the saloon, if they hadn't decided to string him up immediately. 23 years, Townsend's voice carried across the square. 23 years this girl has lived among us, eaten our food, slept under our protection. And this is how she repays us? Martha Henley, the preacher's wife, clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It ain't natural, she whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. Helping one of them savages. There's something wrong with her. Richera felt the weight of their stares, the heat of their anger. These weren't strangers. These were people who'd watched her grow up, who'd traded at Murphy's store while she swept the floors, who'd nodded politely when they passed her on the street. Now they looked at her like she was something dangerous, something foreign. I was helping an injured man, she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Nothing more. An injured Apache who's been raiding our settlements. Townsend spun to face her, his face red with fury. You think those are just scratches on him? That's powder burns, girl. Fresh ones. He was in a fight with our people not 2 hours ago. The crowd pressed closer, their faces hard and unforgiving. Richera could smell their fear beneath the anger. Fear of the Apache raids that had been getting bolder, more frequent. Fear that their safe little town wasn't as protected as they'd believed. Doc Peterson stepped forward, his medical bag clutched in his weathered hands. John, maybe we should— Don't you John me, Doc. Townsend cut him off. You didn't see what I saw in those Mitchell children's eyes after the raid. You didn't help bury good men because this savage and his friends decided they wanted our cattle. Richera's throat tightened. She hadn't known about any recent raids, any fresh violence. Living quietly on the edge of town, working at Murphy's store, she'd somehow missed the latest escalation in the conflict that had been simmering for months. But it wouldn't have mattered. Even knowing what Swift Eagle might have done, she couldn't have walked away from a bleeding human being. That wasn't who she was, no matter what these people thought they knew about her. The penalty for treason is exile, Townsend announced, his words falling like hammer blows. You got 1 hour to gather what you can carry. Then you walk out of Cedar Flats and you don't come back. Ever. The finality in his voice hit her like a physical blow. Exile meant death in this harsh country. The desert didn't forgive, especially not a woman alone with limited supplies. But the faces around her showed no mercy, no doubt about the righteousness of their decision. Murphy cleared his throat nervously. Now hold on, John. Maybe that's a bit harsh. You want to join her, Murphy? Townsend's hand dropped to his gun belt. You want to explain to your customers why you're employing Apache sympathizers? Murphy's face went pale and he stepped back quickly. No, sir, no, she don't work for me no more. The words stung more than Richera expected. Murphy had been kind to her, given her work when she'd needed it most. But kindness only went so far when survival was at stake. As the crowd began to disperse, satisfied that justice had been served, Richera caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the square, partially hidden behind the blacksmith's shop, was a man she recognized but hadn't seen in almost 2 years. Garrett Walsh. Tall, lean, with those pale blue eyes that never missed anything. He wore the dust-covered clothes of a man who'd been riding hard, and his horse was tied to the hitching post nearby, flanks still heaving from exertion. Their eyes met across the distance, and Walsh touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that looked casual but carried weight. Then he melted back into the shadows between buildings, disappearing as quietly as he'd appeared. Richera's hands began to tremble, and not from fear of exile. Walsh's presence here now could only mean one thing. Word was already traveling, the wrong kind of word to the wrong kind of people. She had less time than she'd thought. As Townsend's voice boomed behind her, organizing a watch to make sure she actually left town, Richera hurried toward her small room behind the store. 1 hour to pack, 1 hour before they drove her into the desert to die. But as she threw her few possessions into a canvas bag, her fingers found something wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her trunk. Something she'd hoped never to touch again. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, and the metal still gleamed despite its age. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing an ornate silver badge. Not the tin star of a local sheriff, but something more official, more important. The engraving was still clear after all these years. U.S. Federal Marshal. Rachera stared at the badge for a long moment, remembering the weight it used to carry, the authority it represented, the life she'd walked away from to disappear into the anonymity of a small frontier town. She rewrapped the badge and slipped it into her bag. Then she checked the loads in the small pistol hidden beneath her spare dress. 6 shots. It would have to be enough, because Garrett Walsh's presence meant her past had finally caught up with her. And if her suspicions were right, the people of Cedar Flats had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. As she prepared to walk out into the desert that was supposed to be her death sentence, Rachera allowed herself a grim smile. They thought they were getting rid of a problem. They had no idea they'd just unleashed one. The desert sun climbed higher as Rachera walked away from Cedar Flats, each step taking her further from the only home she'd known for 2 years. Behind her, the town grew smaller until it was just a smudge of brown buildings against the endless expanse of sand and rock. But she wasn't walking aimlessly into the wasteland like they expected. Every step was calculated, every direction chosen with purpose. The federal marshal training never really left you. It just waited dormant until you needed it again. 3 miles out, she found what she was looking for. A cluster of red rocks that formed a natural shelter, hidden from view unless you knew exactly where to look. She'd scouted this place months ago, back when she'd first arrived in Cedar Flats and was still thinking like someone who might need to disappear quickly. Rachera settled into the shade and pulled out a leather canteen, taking small sips to conserve water. The desert was unforgiving, but she'd survived worse. Much worse. Her thoughts drifted back to Denver, to the case that had destroyed her career and nearly gotten her killed. The Castellano gang had been running guns to hostile tribes, stirring up conflicts that left dozens of settlers dead. She'd spent 8 months infiltrating their operation, gathering evidence, building trust. Then everything went wrong in a single night of blood and betrayal. The memory of Agent Morrison's face as he died in her arms still haunted her dreams. 3 other federal marshals dead because someone had sold them out to Castellano. Someone who knew their every move, their every plan. She'd barely escaped with her life, and when the dust settled, the investigation pointed to her as the leak. No evidence, just suspicion and convenient timing. Her own agency had burned her, left her to face Castellano's vengeance alone. That's when she disappeared. Fake name, fake history, becoming just another drifter looking for work in a frontier town. For 2 years, she'd been Sarah Mitchell, store clerk and nobody special. For 2 years, she'd almost believed it herself, but saving Swift Eagle had changed everything. The act of mercy that got her exiled had also sent ripples through networks she'd hoped to never touch again. And Garrett Walsh's presence meant those ripples had reached dangerous ears. A sound made her freeze, the distant rumble of approaching horses. Rachera pressed herself against the rock face and peered around the edge. 5 riders coming from the direction of town, moving fast and purposeful. Even at this distance, she recognized Townsend's broad shoulders and aggressive posture. They weren't content to let the desert kill her slowly. They were coming to finish the job. Rachera checked her pistol again, then quickly gathered dry brush and arranged it in a small pile. She struck a match and watched the thin smoke rise straight up in the still air. A signal, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. The riders were closing fast now, spread out in a search pattern. Townsend's voice carried across the desert as he shouted orders to his men. They had rope with them, probably planning to drag her back to town for a more public execution. She closed her eyes and made a decision that would change everything. Reaching into her bag, she unwrapped the federal marshal badge and pinned it to her vest. The weight of it felt strange after 2 years, but also somehow right. Then she pulled out a small mirror and angled it to catch the afternoon sun, sending bright flashes in a specific pattern toward the distant mountains. 3 long flashes, 2 short, 3 long again. The old signal for federal agent in distress. If her calculations were right, if her message had reached the right people, if her former contacts were still where she thought they were, help would come. But it would take time she might not have. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Townsend and his men had spotted her shelter. Rachera drew her pistol and waited. The woman who'd meekly accepted exile an hour ago was gone. What faced Townsend now was a federal marshal with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. But as the riders approached her position, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. A 6th horse in the distance. Hanging back from the main group, the The rider sat straight and still, watching the confrontation unfold. Garrett Walsh was making sure she didn't escape again, and that meant the real danger wasn't Townsend and his rope. It was what Walsh represented, and what he'd do to keep her quiet about Denver forever. Townsend's horse reared as the first shot rang out, the bullet whining off the rocks inches from Rachira's position. She stayed low, counting muzzle flashes. 5 men with rifles, spread out in a loose semicircle, using their horses for cover. "Come out peaceful, girl." Townsend's voice echoed off the stone walls. "No need to make this harder than it has to be." Rachira almost laughed at that. Harder than it had to be? They'd come armed for war against one woman they thought was helpless. If they only knew what kind of war they'd actually started. She waited for them to reload, then popped up and put a bullet through the closest man's shoulder. He screamed and tumbled from his saddle, his rifle clattering across the rocks. The others scattered, suddenly realizing their quarry had teeth. "Where'd she learn to shoot like that?" one of them shouted. "Don't matter," Townsend barked back. "She's only got 6 shots. 5 now," Rachira corrected silently. But they didn't know about the spare ammunition in her saddlebags, or the knife strapped to her thigh, or the 20 different ways she'd been trained to kill a man with her bare hands. Another volley of shots peppered her position, sending rock chips flying. She kept her head down and let them waste ammunition while she planned her next move. The sun was getting lower, which meant shadows were lengthening. Night fighting would favor her. But something was wrong. The pattern of gunfire was too organized, too professional. These weren't angry townspeople firing wild. Someone was directing them, calling shots, coordinating their movements. She risked a glance around the rock and spotted him. Garrett Walsh had moved closer, close enough that she could see his lips moving as he gave quiet instructions to Townsend's men. The pale eyes that had haunted her nightmares for 2 years met hers across the desert, and he smiled. That smile told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about her helping an Apache. This was about finishing what started in Denver. Walsh had been the leak, the one who sold out the federal marshals to Castellano. And now, he was tying up the last loose end. The realization filled her with cold fury. Morrison, Davidson, Chen, Wright, all dead because of the man now directing fire against her position. All dead because Walsh had sold federal secrets for Castellano gold. A bullet sparked off the rocks near her head, snapping her back to the immediate danger. Townsend's men were advancing, using covering fire to get closer. In minutes, they'd be close enough to rush her position. That's when she heard it. A sound that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Thunder. Not the distant rumble of a storm, but the rhythmic pounding of many horses moving fast. The sound grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls, multiplying until it seemed like an army was approaching. Townsend's men heard it too. Their firing slackened as they turned to look toward the sound. Even Walsh straightened in his saddle, his professional calm finally cracking. "What the hell is that?" Townsend muttered. The first rider appeared on the ridge above them, like something out of a legend. A massive man on a black horse, wearing the blue uniform of the U.S. Cavalry. Behind him came another, then another, until the entire ridgeline was filled with mounted soldiers. But these weren't ordinary cavalry. Rachira's trained eye picked out details that made her breath catch. The uniforms were too crisp, the weapons too new, the horses too fine. These were federal marshals disguised as cavalry, riding in force. At their head rode a figure she recognized even at this distance. Marshal Samuel Hayes, her former commanding officer, the man who'd believed in her innocence when no one else would. He sat his horse like a statue, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his hat. "Federal Marshal Service!" Hayes's voice boomed across the desert. "Lay down your weapons!" Townsend's men looked around in confusion, their rifles wavering. They'd come to lynch a traitor and found themselves facing 100 armed federal agents. The math was simple even for them, but Walsh wasn't giving up so easily. Rachira saw him reach for his pistol, saw the desperation in his eyes. If she lived to testify about Denver, his carefully constructed life would crumble. He'd rather die fighting than face a federal noose. "He's the one!" Rachira shouted, pointing at Walsh. "Garrett Walsh, he's the leak from Denver." Walsh's pistol cleared leather, but not toward her. He spun and put a bullet in Townsend's chest, then wheeled his horse toward the canyon mouth. If he could reach the narrow passage, he might escape in the confusion. Rachira didn't hesitate. She stepped out from behind the rocks, raised her pistol with both hands, and put 2-shot center mass into Walsh's back. He pitched forward over his horse's neck and hit the ground hard, rolling twice before coming to rest face down in the sand. The desert fell silent except for the sound of Townsend's labored breathing and the stamping of horses. Hayes rode down from the ridge, his men following in perfect formation. As he approached, Rachera saw something unexpected in his weathered face. Respect. Marshal Castellanos, he said formally, using her real name for the first time in 2 years. Good to have you back. Rachera looked down at the badge pinned to her vest, feeling its weight differently now. Not the burden of a life she'd lost, but the symbol of a job that needed finishing. Good to be back, sir, she replied. Though I think we need to discuss my assignment to a certain Apache prisoner. Hayes raised an eyebrow. What about him? He's not just any Apache, Rachera said, pieces falling into place in her mind. He's the one who's been trying to send messages to the federal government about Castellanos' gun running. Walsh couldn't let him reach us alive. The sound of approaching horses from town made them all turn. But what they saw wasn't reinforcements for Townsend. It was the people of Cedar Flats, riding hard, led by Doc Peterson and Murphy. And they weren't coming to fight. They were coming to apologize. Because word had finally reached them about who they'd just exiled into the desert, and what she'd been trying to protect them from all along. Doc Peterson rode at the front of the group from Cedar Flats, his face pale with shame and urgency. Behind him came Murphy, Martha Henley, and a dozen other townspeople who'd participated in Rachera's exile just hours before. Their horses were lathered with sweat from the hard ride. "Marshal Castellanos," Doc Peterson called out as he approached. We need to talk." Hayes looked between Rachera and the approaching townspeople, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. The federal marshals behind him maintained their formation, ready for trouble. "Speak your piece, Doc," Rachera said, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning inside her. Peterson dismounted, his legs shaky from the ride and what he'd learned. "After you left, we got a telegram from Fort Collins. About Garrett Walsh, about what really happened in Denver, about who you really are." He pulled a crumpled yellow paper from his vest pocket. "Says here you're a decorated federal marshal who went undercover to break up a gun-running operation. Says you've been protecting settlements across 3 territories for the past 2 years. Murphy stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment. "We also heard about the Apache you saved. Turns out he's been carrying intelligence about Castellanos' gang for months, trying to reach federal authorities. Those raids we blamed him for? They were him attacking Castellanos' supply lines." Rachera felt a mix of vindication and bitter irony. Swift Eagle hadn't been raiding innocent settlers. He'd been fighting the same enemy she was, just from the other side of a racial divide that had blinded everyone to the truth. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Still locked up," Peterson admitted. "But alive. We didn't know." Marshal Hayes surveyed the group of ashamed townspeople with the cold eye of a career lawman. "Ignorance isn't an excuse for nearly executing a federal agent and a valuable intelligence asset. We know that now." Martha Henley spoke up, her voice small. "We came to make it right." "Make it right?" Rachera's anger finally broke through her professional calm. "You drove me into the desert to die because I showed mercy to a wounded man. You were ready to hang an Apache who's been risking his life to protect your families. How exactly do you make that right?" The weight of her words settled over the group like a physical force. These people had let fear and prejudice guide them to the edge of multiple murders. The shame in their faces was real, but it wouldn't bring back the other victims of their blind hatred. Hayes cleared his throat. "The immediate priority is Swift Eagle. We need his intelligence about Castellanos' remaining operations." "There's more," Doc Peterson said reluctantly. "The telegram mentioned something about Castellano himself. He's not just running guns anymore. Word is he's planning something big. Something that could start a full-scale war between the tribes and the settlers." Rachera felt ice form in her stomach. She'd spent 8 months learning how Castellanos' mind worked. He was cunning, patient, and absolutely ruthless. If he was planning something big, it would be devastating. "What kind of war?" Hayes demanded. "The telegram wasn't clear," Murphy answered, "but it mentioned weapons shipments moving toward Apache territory. Enough guns to arm 500 warriors." The implications hit everyone at the same time. 500 armed Apache warriors believing they were fighting to protect their people, led by false intelligence provided by Castellano. And on the other side, settler militias convinced the tribes were planning mass genocide. It would be a bloodbath that could last for years. If you were Rachera, what would you do? Trust the people who exiled you to help prevent a war. Or handle this federal operation alone with just Hayes and his men. Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose. Because what Rachira decided next would determine whether hundreds of innocent people lived or died. We ride back to town, Rachira announced, her voice cutting through the tension. All of us. We get Swift Eagle out of that jail, and we get his intelligence. Then we stop Castellano, before he starts a war. She looked directly at the townspeople who'd betrayed her. But understand this, you follow my orders now. Every one of them. Because if you don't, a lot of good people are going to die for your stupidity. The sun was setting as the combined group rode back toward Cedar Flats. Behind them, Garrett Walsh's body lay cooling in the desert sand, taking his secrets to the grave. But ahead of them waited a reckoning that would test whether redemption was possible, and whether old enemies could become unlikely allies in the face of a greater threat. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. The jail behind Murphy's saloon was little more than a wooden cage, but Swift Eagle sat inside it with the dignity of a chief. Blood had crusted on his shoulder, where Rachira's makeshift bandages had held, and his dark eyes tracked every movement as the combined group approached. When he saw Rachira wearing the federal marshal badge, his expression shifted to something like understanding. "You are not who they thought you were," he said in clear English, surprising several of the townspeople. "Neither are you," Rachira replied, pulling the keys from Peterson's reluctant hands. "We need to talk. About Castellano, about the guns, about what's really happening." As the cell door swung open, Swift Eagle stood slowly, favoring his wounded shoulder. Hayes stepped forward, his weathered face serious. "Federal Marshal Samuel Hayes," he introduced himself. "We received word you've been trying to contact us about illegal weapons sales." Swift Eagle nodded gravely. "For 3 moons I have watched the gun runner called Castellano poison my people's minds. He sells weapons to young warriors, tells them the white settlers plan to kill all Apache. Then he sells information to the settlers, tells them we plan to attack. The terrible simplicity of it hit everyone at once. Castellano wasn't just running guns, he was orchestrating conflict from both sides, profiting from the escalating violence while remaining safely in the middle." "How many weapons has he moved?" Rachira asked. "Enough to arm every warrior in 3 tribes, Swift Eagle replied grimly. "But that is not the worst part. He has convinced the war chief Whitehawk that the soldiers are coming to destroy our sacred burial grounds. He showed false papers, forged orders." Hayes cursed under his breath. "Whitehawk's been peaceful for 5 years. If Castellano's convinced him the army's planning to desecrate Apache burial sites, he will unite every tribe from here to Mexico," Swift Eagle finished. "And they will fight to the death." The magnitude of Castellano's plan became clear. A massive Apache uprising, triggered by manufactured evidence, met by panicked settler militias armed with his weapons. The resulting war would devastate both populations while Castellano disappeared with enough gold to live like a king. "When?" Rachira demanded. "Tomorrow at dawn," Swift Eagle said quietly. "Whitehawk plans to attack the army supply depot at Copper Canyon. He believes it contains weapons meant for a campaign against our people. 24 hours. Less than a day to prevent a war that could kill thousands." Murphy spoke up nervously. "What's really at Copper Canyon?" "Medical supplies and winter blankets," Hayes answered grimly. "Humanitarian aid for the reservations. If Whitehawk attacks it, the army will assume it's the beginning of a coordinated uprising," Rachira finished. "They'll call in every available unit and hit back hard." Swift Eagle nodded. "Castellano has made it so both sides will believe they are defending against genocide. The truth will not matter once the blood starts flowing." Rachira's mind raced through possibilities. They could ride to Copper Canyon and warn the army, but that would only prevent one battle. Whitehawk would still believe the false intelligence, and Castellano would simply trigger the conflict somewhere else. They could try to reach Whitehawk directly, but an Apache war chief preparing for battle wouldn't listen to white settlers, even ones with federal badges. The cultural divide was too deep, the distrust too ingrained. But there was a third option. Dangerous, probably suicidal, but it might work. "We take Castellano," she announced. "Tonight, before dawn, we capture him alive and make him confess to both sides." Hayes stared at her. "His camp will be heavily defended, and we don't even know where he is." "I do," Swift Eagle said quietly. "He moves every few days, but always to places I have watched. Tonight he camps at Dead Horse Canyon 5 miles north, 20 men guard him. 20 men against how many of us? Rachira looked around at their makeshift force. Hayes had brought 15 federal marshals. The townspeople numbered another dozen, though most were better suited to shopkeeping than gunfighting. The odds don't matter, she decided. If we don't stop Castellano tonight, by tomorrow this whole territory will be burning. Doc Peterson stepped forward, his medical bag in his hands. I'm coming with you. Whatever happens, there'll be wounded to tend. One by one, the other townspeople nodded their agreement. Murphy, Martha Henley, even the blacksmith who'd been calling for Swift Eagle's head just hours before. Fear had united them the wrong way before. Now shame and determination would unite them the right way. Swift Eagle looked at Rachira with something approaching respect. You would trust these people to fight beside you, after what they did? Rachira glanced at the faces around her, people who'd exiled her, betrayed her, nearly gotten her killed, but also people who'd ridden into the desert to apologize, who were now volunteering to risk their lives to fix their mistakes. Sometimes people need a chance to prove they're better than their worst moment, she said. Hayes began organizing the assault plan, but Rachira found herself thinking about tomorrow. If they succeeded, if they captured Castellano and prevented the war, what then? Could she ever really trust these people again? Could she go back to being Sarah Mitchell, store clerk, after wearing the federal marshal badge? More importantly, after everything that had happened, after all the blood and betrayal and pain, did she want to? As the group prepared to ride toward Dead Horse Canyon and what might be their deaths, Rachira realized that the next few hours would determine more than just the fate of two peoples on the brink of war. They would determine who she really was and who she wanted to be when the shooting stopped. Dead Horse Canyon lived up to its name in the pre-dawn darkness. The rocky walls rose on either side like tombstones, and the narrow passage reeked of old death and desperate men. Rachira crouched behind a boulder, watching Castellanos camp through the scope of a borrowed rifle. 23 men, not 20. Swift Eagle's count had been close, but in a gunfight, 3 extra rifles could mean the difference between victory and massacre. Castellano himself sat by the central fire, his silver hair gleaming in the firelight as he studied maps and spoke quietly with his lieutenants. Even at this distance, seeing him again made Rachira's hands shake with rage. The man who'd killed Morrison, who'd destroyed her career, who was now orchestrating a war that would slaughter hundreds of innocents. Tonight, it ended. Hayes moved up beside her, his voice barely a whisper. Federal marshals are in position on the north wall. Your townspeople are covering the south approach. Swift Eagles circling around to block the rear exit. It was a good plan, as good as they could manage with mixed forces and limited time. But plans rarely survived contact with desperate criminals, and Castellano's men were the worst kind of desperate. Remember, Rachira whispered to the group, we need Castellano alive. He's the only one who can convince both sides this war is a lie. Murphy nodded nervously, checking his rifle for the 10th time. Martha Henley crouched nearby, her face pale but determined. These weren't soldiers, but they were here anyway, trying to make amends for their earlier blindness. The signal came as a nightbird's call from Hayes's position. Time to move. Rachira rose and stepped into the firelight, her federal marshal badge catching the flames. Castellano! Federal Marshal Service, you're under arrest! The camp exploded into chaos. Men dove for weapons, scattered for cover, shouted warnings and curses. But Castellano himself just smiled and stood slowly, his hands empty but unafraid. Marshal Isabella Castellanos, he said, her real name rolling off his tongue like a caress. I wondered when you'd finally come home. The gunfight erupted around them as his men opened fire on the hidden federal marshals. Muzzle flashes lit the canyon walls like deadly lightning, and the thunder of gunshots echoed off the rocks. But Rachira kept her rifle trained on Castellano, who hadn't moved for a weapon. It's over, she shouted over the noise. Your man Walsh is dead. We know about the fake intelligence, the weapons sales, all of it. Castellano laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You think this is about money? About guns? He gestured toward the battle raging around them. This is about showing the world what you people really are, savages pretending to be civilized. A bullet sparked off the rock near Rachira's head, but she didn't flinch. You're starting a war to prove a point? I'm revealing a truth, Castellano snarled. When the killing starts tomorrow, when Apache and settler tear each other apart, the world will see that some races can never live in peace. That separation is the only answer. The twisted logic hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't about profit or revenge. It was about validating hatred itself. Castellano wanted the war to happen, wanted the bloodshed and the mutual destruction, because it would prove his racist worldview. Around them, the battle was turning. Hayes's federal marshals were professional fighters, and even the townspeople were holding their ground. Castellano's men were falling back, their return fire growing sporadic. But Castellano himself pulled a hidden pistol and aimed it not at Rachera, but toward where Swift Eagle was advancing through the rocks. "If I can't have my war," he said coldly, "I'll settle for starting it with one dead Apache." Rachera didn't hesitate. Her rifle cracked once and Castellano spun sideways, his pistol flying from nerveless fingers. He hit the ground hard, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted with pain and rage. "You shot me," he gasped, as if he couldn't believe it. "I shot your gun arm," Rachera corrected, advancing with her rifle ready. "You'll live to stand trial. You'll live to confess to both sides what you've done, and you'll live to watch Apache and settler build peace instead of war." The last of his men threw down their weapons as federal marshals closed in from all sides. Swift Eagle emerged from the rocks unharmed, his own rifle covering the prisoners. The townspeople looked around in amazement, realizing they'd actually survived their first real gunfight. As dawn broke over Dead Horse Canyon, Rachera bound Castellano's wound with strips torn from his own shirt. Rough justice, but he'd live to face proper justice. "The war chief Whitehawk will not believe words from white men," Swift Eagle said quietly. "But he will believe the confession of his enemy, spoken under Apache truth rituals." Hayes nodded grimly. "And the army will believe a federal investigation with documented evidence. We can stop this." By noon, riders were racing toward Copper Canyon and Apache territory, carrying news that would prevent a massacre. Castellano's confession, extracted through careful interrogation and verified by captured documents, revealed the full scope of his manipulation. That evening, as the combined group rode back toward Cedar Flats, Doc Peterson fell in beside Rachera. "So what now? You going back to being our store clerk?" Rachera looked at the federal marshal badge on her vest, then at the townspeople who'd followed her into battle, people who'd exiled her in fear and ignorance, then risked their lives to make it right. "I think Cedar Flats needs a sheriff," she said finally. "Someone who understands that justice isn't about us versus them. It's about protecting everyone." Swift Eagle, riding nearby, nodded approvingly. "A good sheriff would also need to know both both ways of thinking." "Are you offering to be my deputy?" Rachera asked with a slight smile. "I am offering to be a bridge," he replied, "so that what happened with Castellano never happens again." As they crested the hill overlooking Cedar Flats, Rachera saw the town spread out below them in the golden afternoon light. It looked different now, not like a prison or a hiding place, but like a community that had learned something important about itself. The badge on her vest caught the sun, no longer a burden from her past but a tool for building a better future. She'd come to this town as a fugitive seeking anonymity. She was returning as exactly who she was meant to be. Marshal Isabella Castellanos was home. If you enjoyed the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more stories like this. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one. With justice so powerful and revenge so complete, you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.